Right, I want to thank you all for being here. I also want to thank Annette Hinklemeyer, Annette Hinkle, who is not here. Is that correct? I can't see.
So far, yes.
Annette Hinkle, who wrote a wonderful article about Wendy, which I read and I thought, oh, this just sounds like a fantastic book. And oh, I'm so sorry, but I have to tell you one other thing. This is important. We have our library budget vote tomorrow. And it's really important. Let me just tell you how important it is that you vote. We have 14,000 library district residents. 14,000. For the 2018 budget, 184 people voted in all. So this is no joke. I mean, we want your vote, of course, obviously. We care how you vote, but you vote however you want. But the thing is to vote, because any little faction of people can swing this election one way or the other easily, as you can see by these numbers. So if you're in our library district, if you are registered to vote, come to this room tomorrow between 10 and 8. Try to come by 7:45 and just vote in this election. Thank you for reminding me. I got a little look from Joanna. Okay, on to Wendy. I also wanted to thank the Southampton Historical Museum for being very interested in this event and for co-sponsoring it with us and putting it in their newsletter. Wendy Moonan is here, of course, this evening to talk about her terrific book, New York Splendor, the City's Most Memorable Rooms, which was published by Rizzoli. This is, Rizzoli, as you know, is a very high quality publisher and color images on, I think, almost every page, so it's quite an extraordinary book. Wendy Moonan has been writing about architecture, design, and antiques for 30 years. She did her undergraduate work at Wellesley, went on to receive a certificate from the Sorbonne in French civilization, and later was awarded a Nieman Foundation Fellowship at Harvard. Since the 1970s, when she was in nursery school, since the 1970s, her work has appeared in a wide variety of prestigious outlets, including the New York Times Magazine, where she was a staff editor for 5 years, the International Herald Tribune, where she was the weekend section founding editor from 1980 to 1982, Architectural Digest, for which she was contributing writer from 2000 through 2013, and the New York Times weekend section as the weekly antiques columnist from 1996 through 2011. She currently is a contributing writer for Architectural Record and Smithsonian Magazine and a regular contributor to Hampton's Cottages and Gardens. Wendy Moonan is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Sir John Soanes Museum Foundation, and when she is not writing or volunteering, she enjoys visiting museums, jogging, attending the theater, and going on architecture and design tours around the world. She does point out, however, that she has learned more by sitting in the living rooms of connoisseurs, artists, and patrons than anywhere else. It is such an honor to have her here. Please welcome Wendy Moonan. I'm going to dim the lights.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I have to say it took me an hour to get here from Sag Harbor, so I'm very grateful. And thank you for that beautiful introduction. I am going to... I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the projects in the book and how I came to write it. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, because I come from a family of very, very talented people. My grandfather was a painter who moved to Japan after World War II and was embraced and wildly popular against all odds. I think he was probably the first American after the war that the Japanese kind of took to. And suddenly he was selling every painting, and he was getting old and deaf, and he said to my mother, his daughter, why don't you just come and enjoy my fame and money, because I don't. And so we lived in the Imperial Hotel for a year, and it was Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece, but it also had a lot of cubby holes and places to hide. It used to be called Wendy the Imperial. And I was given painting lessons. I had no talent, but that was kind of fun. And my mother was a very talented costume jewelry designer. She had a company called Authentics, because everything was frankly fake. And she sold at Saks and Bonwits and Bergdorf's. And my father was a very, very talented, well, his mother, my grandmother, my English grandmother was a pianist and taught her sons the viola and the cello. And my father played the cello like a gypsy, and his brother was with the London Philharmonic. My brother is an amateur architect and has built 4 houses. I mean, everybody seems to have talent except me. I had another, my American grandmother was an industrial designer who had her own company in Chicago, and she did extremely well until the Depression. She wrote a book in 1916 called The New Interior, Modern Decoration for the Modern House, which is very edgy and way more interesting than some of the other books that were Elsie DeWolf and that kind of thing that was going on then. And my grandmother's mostly famous for being a consultant to the Kohler bathroom fixtures company and suggesting they have colored sinks and tubs, and it was a terrible flop, and it really wasn't until after World War II, where she's long dead, that people embraced bathrooms with colorful tubs. Anyway, I really think that the reason that I like writing about architects and designers is because I have no talents of my own, so I like to write about theirs. And that's really what this book is all about. So I was very pleased when Rizzoli asked me to do it a couple of years ago. And there are a few projects that I had scouted and written about for all the various magazines. But mostly I just called up my favorite decorators and architects and said, what's new? And we started from there. So that's how it all happened. So I'm going to start with this. This is the foyer, the tiny foyer of the acclaimed New York interior designer Alex Papakristides. You may know him from, he has a house out here as well. This tiny foyer is in a lavish Upper East Side apartment, but it's a 1960s building and the ceilings are very low. So that inspired him to do it up royally. He tentered the mitered ceiling and covered the turquoise walls with a bold striped fabric that had been designed by Oscar de la Renta. He stenciled a Russian-style inlaid wood pattern on the floor, and then he put a double-sided antique chinoiserie bookcase diagonally across the middle. And that, oddly enough, makes this tiny space look bigger. The charming glass chandelier is decorated with colorful tall flowers, and there's a little whimsical dog that sits quietly under the mirror. For being such a tiny space, I think it's impossibly glamorous. This is another splendid foyer that is quite the opposite. Not cozy, but palatial. It's in the Fifth Avenue apartment that Randolph Hearst gave his wife Veronica as a wedding gift. They hired Renzo Mongiardino, the Milanese master decorator, to decorate the apartment. But Renzo really didn't like coming to New York, and it was really one of the last projects he completed in the city. In Europe, he famously worked for the Agnellis and the Rothschilds and Baron Heinrich Thyssen-Bornemisza, and he did wonderful sets. He did Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, and his secret is nothing is valuable. For this 35-foot long, 12-foot high space, everything is faux. The doors to the elevator landing are painted, not inlaid, with colorful Renaissance-style ornamental arabesque motifs inspired by those in the Vatican. The patchwork marble walls are simply painted on, as is the cornice. Only the chandelier's floor and ancient busts are real. This is where the Hearsts famously entertained Princess Diana, among many others. And then after Randolph's death, Veronica sold the apartment. One can only hope the new owners didn't change the foyer. My book is a very eclectic mix. It's not meant to be comprehensive or a proper history, though it does stretch from about 1970 to 2017. It's just a collection of rooms that were chosen to wow you. In 2015, after the minimalist architect Michael Gabellini had just finished a top-to-bottom, 7-year reconstruction of a handsome Warren and Wetmore brownstone near Fifth Avenue on the Upper West Side, his clients, they decided they had to have a basketball court and an indoor pool. This required excavating 35 feet under the house. No mean engineering feat, to add 2 subterranean levels to the 5-story house. After installing a light well in the back garden, Gabellini was able to illuminate this pool with a combination of natural and artificial light. That gives the room its luminous glow. And I think, like a grotto, it's as good a place for contemplation as swimming. There are a few rooms in my book that are no longer extant. These are rooms that I never visited and always wished that I had. The late fashion designer Bill Glass' Sutton Place apartment is a perfect example. Working with Mika Erdogan and Chessie Rayner of the firm Mac II, Glass created a classical setting for his architectural models and globes and drawings and books. His bedroom was also his museum, his art gallery, and his library, as you can see from the wear and tear of the leather armchair. As Mika Erdogan told me, Bill owned the most amazing antique furniture, art, and statuary that he collected in his travels. He wanted to have large open spaces to best show off his collection. Here we see the other side of the same room. Behind the bronze replica of Trajan's column in Rome, a mural-sized trompe-l'oeil painting of a rifle rack sits, of all things. As in his wonderful memoir, Bill Glass described his style at home. Quote, "What I have here is the result of a lifetime of collecting," he wrote. "There is no relationship between the things themselves, except that I like them." This is Brooke Astor's much admired library, which I also never had the privilege to visit. Of the 14 rooms in her 778 Park Avenue duplex, social doyen Brooke Astor's favorite was her library, perhaps because of her love for books. And as you may know, she was famously generous to the New York Public Library. She rescued it time and again. Yet this room almost never happened. After Mrs. Astor's husband died, she hired Pierre Chalet to decorate her duplex. All the rooms except this one, because it originally had Louis XV style antique carved wood paneling that was very valuable. In the late 1970s, Mrs. Astor invited Albert Hadley to tea, being such a polite woman, to tell him she decided to ask someone else, the preeminent English decorator Geoffrey Benson, to reimagine the library. Hadley was shocked. Thinking very quickly, he told her, quote, "Why not replace this antique wood paneling with something chic and new, like red lacquered walls with brass-trimmed floor-to-ceiling bookshelves?" Mrs. Astor loved the idea and never hired Benson. And I can tell you, in all my years at Town and Country and House and Garden and Digest, this room has been copied poorly so many times. And nobody seems to be able to do it well, which sounds funny, but it's true. This is architect Bill George's Upper East Side townhouse, which he gutted and then added a glass curtain wall in the rear so he could have a double-height living room and a view of the garden. He's a very eclectic collector. One whole wall on the left is covered by a painting by Julian Schnabel, another not seen by a portrait of George's by Alex Katz. Under the vintage disco wall are 2 velvet zebra slipper chairs that he actually designed. It's all very glam, especially at night. He's a wonderful architect, but he's a crazy decorator. is the enchanting bedroom that the late beloved artist, heiress, and blue jeans entrepreneur Gloria Vanderbilt designed in her former townhouse. She and her husband were avid collectors of antique American quilts, a habit that actually happened in Southampton. I don't think I've been here long enough to know what store sold vintage quilts here, but I think Gloria was one of the very best customers, and she bought them by the pound. She decided in this bedroom to cover the ceiling, the walls, and the floors with quilts. She found they were an excellent backdrop to display her paintings, which she continued to create on a daily basis until a couple of months ago when she died at age 95. She was a charming, talented woman, and so gracious. She hated being interviewed, and she was completely adorable. In 2013, when a Park Avenue couple was able to buy an apartment adjoining their own, they went to top talents, architect Robert A.M. Stern, who has a house in East Hampton, as you may know, and decorator Brian McCarthy, with instructions to pull out all the stops in the dining room, where they planned to host huge buffet dinners. By taking down some walls, Stern was able to create a 20 by 20 foot square room. And then they elevated by inserting a recessed circle in a square into the 11-foot ceiling. He added pilasters and an oval-scaled herringbone floor. Then Brian McCarthy took over. He commissioned a Paris atelier to create the exquisite bas-relief molded plaster panels depicting scenes of nature around the walls. When the artisans had completed the panels in Paris, McCarthy brought them into New York for a week to install them. They surrounded each panel with a thick wooden persimmon-colored frame that they then gold-leafed. Then they scraped off most of the gold. Such techniques add to the magical light that infuses this unforgettable room. The pictures absolutely don't do it justice. It's pretty incredible. And the bas-reliefs look like they could be from the 20s, 30s. A couple of decades ago, Donald Orisman, a corporate lawyer and philanthropist, went to the New York and Palm Beach-based architecture firm Fairfax and Sammons to create a library for his pied-à-terre in the Gainsborough Studios on Central Park South. This is a famous building that was made for artists to work in. These are all north-facing windows for artist studios. The library was meant to house his extensive collection of books of literary criticism, poetry, and fiction, as well as 1,800 paintings, each depicting a person in the act of reading. His brief to them: create a 2-story Renaissance-style library that could store books and display art. Sammons designed bays of parallel pale maple bookshelves that come out into the room at right angles. Each surface is articulated with classical moldings and pediments. Mr. Orsman died recently. His family sold the apartment, and we just hope it was to a book lover, because this is a major architecture for Newark. This library, which is on the cover of my book, is in a landmark building on the Upper West Side. The very talented and very private, unheralded New York City interior designer Joanne De Palma worked with her clients for years to decorate the apartment in the aesthetic movement style of the 1880s, just the era when this co-op was built. She traveled to London and Paris with them for years to buy period antiques. For the cavernous library, she started with a rug. As she told me, quote, "I wanted a rug with clear colors that would lift the original dark millwork," unquote. She found an antique Donegal carpet in teal blue and vibrant green with a floral border, then greatly enlarged a William Morris pattern for the fabric on the walls and curtains. She layered the ceiling in pale blues and greens. It's a magical space to be in and enchanting at night. This is the winter garden that the late French decorator Henri Samuel created in a duplex owned by John and Susan Goodfreund at 834 Park Avenue. Mrs. Goodfreund is a serious collector of antiques. She had already acquired the chinoiserie panels that you see here from a chateau in Belgium. So Samuel went to a Paris atelier to paint faux latticework walls to surround them. And then he put in a trompe-l'oeil coffered dome. And then he added the Bessarabian rug and these vintage wicker chairs, gorgeously reupholstered, and a chinoiserie antique ironstone mantel. It's a dreamy place to have a cup of tea, and what I think makes it fresh and not stuffy or too predictable is the Giacometti coffee table. David Rockefeller may have been a billionaire, but the late philanthropist and his wife Peggy lived fairly modestly at home in a double-wide brick townhouse on East 65th Street. The pine paneling that society architect Mont B. Schmidt installed in the living room in the late 1940s served as a quiet backdrop to a drop-dead fabulous collection of Impressionist paintings, modern paintings, pre-Columbian ceramics, and superb Queen Anne and George I, II, III antiques. The pieces, rotated in and out, and the room was different over the years, but I think the key to the success of this room is when the art and furniture are this good, decorating should take a back seat. Based in Southport, Connecticut, which is where I grew up, David Scott Parker is a very rare entity, an architect who's also an antiques dealer. He's most acclaimed, at least in the press, for his meticulous architectural preservation work, notably for the U.S. Treasury in Washington and the Williamsburg Savings Bank in Brooklyn, which is now a party hall of some renown. In the antiques world, Parker specializes in the aesthetic movement. So of course he was thrilled when a young couple bought a 5-story townhouse on East 72nd Street between Madison and Park, the last private townhouse between Fifth Avenue and Park, I think, and asked them to recreate it into the style in which it was built in 1882. The house had already been gutted before they came to Parker, and all that was left were the door frames and woodwork. Parker rebuilt the interior, and of course, all the things you don't see, plumbing, AC, wiring, all that. And then he found wainscoting from a former Theodore Roosevelt house and cabinets that had been made for a mansion in Newport. And he worked with Mimi Finley, who's a renowned interiors historian, to track down Herder Brothers chairs and Tiffany stained glass windows. Then they wanted to have a glittering ceiling. And the wife wanted it to be silver. And he said, well, if you really want it to look like 1882, you can't do silver because silver tarnishes. So they said, let's do gold, which took quite a lot of research. He ended up going to Japan and getting special gold leaf panels that he could adhere to the ceiling. And I mean, it took weeks just to source the gold leaf. He found them in Japan, applied them to the ceiling, and then stenciled the whole thing to give it extra glamour. And yes, it doesn't fade. This is a shot of the fireplace. Carver spent 2 years in this house, just carving. And all of these potteries are period, as is the light fixture, as are the tiles. You have to be a maniac to do this kind of thing. But it shows David Scott Parker's attention to detail and his love for the period. This is another grand brownstone, the second floor landing or piano nobile of an 1885 townhouse on East 69th Street, with the Chilean-born, New York-based architect Juan Pablo Molina designed for his own family. He commissioned his favorite artisans, most of them in Paris, to lay down the new black and white marble floor and fabricate the bronze glass doors into the living room. The bronze workers work at the Chateau of Versailles. He just is unrelenting in finding these craftsmen who are amazing. For the staircase walls, he has a different Paris atelier to create scenic lacquered wall panels. They depict the Portuguese fleet arriving in China in 1543. And they're on both sides, floor to ceiling, with, of course, golden sails on the boats, just to pick out a little glamour. The striped console is, Moonan says, his tribute to the visionary 18th century French neoclassical architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux. One thing Juan Pablo Molina loves doing is designing furniture, and pity the client because they get so crazy. This is another view from the living room looking out into the hall. I go to a lot of antiques fairs. I've been covering them for years in Paris and the Netherlands, the Tefat Maastricht Fair, and I have to say Moonan is one of the serious shoppers. He comes with a client and they just say yes, no, yes, no. John Saladino, a New York decorator who now lives in Santa Barbara, is a master at creating illusion, a skill he learned while living and working in Rome as a young man. For this dining room of what he calls his client's Venetian palace, he hired a French painter to do a Pompeian-inspired garden mural with fruit trees and birds and lattice fence. And to the astonishment of the painter, when he was finished, Saladino took a wet rag and distressed the whole base of the mural, so it would look like it was very old and flaking and suffering from damp. And yet it really seems like you're in Venice or something. I mean, someplace old. The cool palette of beige and pale green contributes to the outdoor feeling of the space. The mural exaggerates the dimensions of the room, while the beautifully laid table with its layers of sumptuous linen gives the room a human scale. I cut this down to save you. Like many French chateaux, this Central Park South apartment has windows on opposite sides, so it is always bathed in natural light. It had already been gutted when the owners hired their team, uber talent decorator Michael S. Smith, who some of you may know did the Obama White House, and the renowned architecture firm Ferguson and Shamamian, who have done many houses in Southampton. Together, the decorator and architects created a brand new architecture with Venetian plaster walls and lacquered coffers on the 11-foot ceiling. To add more dimension to the palette, they mixed pearl gray, cream, and lavender into the white paint. Shamamian, who's outrageous, commissioned the shimmering floor in India. It is parquet with German silver hand-hammered into it. The Franz Klein painting hangs over a watery mirror that Smith had handmade for the room in the Czech Republic. The only thing new, other than the mirror, is the gilt wood armchair, and that's from Smith's furniture line called Jasper. The space simply glows with refinement. Having light come in from two sides, of course, helps. I think Splendor can be quite simple. This is one floor of the 5-story cast iron factory building that the artist Donald Judd bought in Soho in 1968 when he first started selling his work. The floor plates are huge, 75 by 25 feet, with windows on 2 corners. So he decided to renovate the whole building and turn it into his family's home, his work studio, and an art gallery. Each floor was given a separate function. There was a floor for sleeping, a floor for making art, a floor for displaying art, and this floor is called the eating floor. Judd frequently entertained his fellow artists at dinners that lasted deep into the night. The room had a huge open kitchen with shelves stacked with dishes and glasses. When Judd died in 1994, his children decided to turn the building into a museum run by the Judd Foundation. And it's now open by appointment and pretty magical. It looks as if Judd just went out for a cup of coffee. It has pots and pans and earthenware bowls, the pot-bellied stove, dining table and chairs he designed. The only decoration is the art made by his friends Frank Stella and Dan Flavin and John Chamberlain and Saul LeWitt. He traded art, and he had very good taste in who he decided to trade with. In this photo, there's a very colorful mural in the rear left, which you can barely see. It's by David Novros, and it was painted on site. And it appears damaged here, but since this picture was taken, it's been fully restored by the foundation. In 2014, when architect Stephen Harris, a professor at the Yale Architecture School, and his decorating partner, Lucian Reese Roberts, were asked to build and decorate a new penthouse on top of a historical building in Tribeca, they faced a big dilemma. The building on Harrison Street was high enough to see the charming old red Mercantile Exchange Tower, which can be barely seen in the back, behind the sculpture. But the building's tall parapet blocked much of the rest of the view. They came up with an extremely ingenious solution. One most people would never think of. They raised the floor 4 feet. That allowed them to put a thick layer of earth on the roof so they could plant honey locusts and cherry trees, install a reflecting pool, and have an area for outdoor dining. Now the views are outstanding. The tracks for the sliding glass doors are slightly below floor level, so the living room opens seamlessly to the terrace. Reese Roberts designed all the furniture for the client, including a dining room table that he commissioned from a Brooklyn craftsman called Ian Engberg, who had access to jacaranda veneers from the 1960s. As Reese Robert recalls today, quote, "We had an ideal client who gave us the freedom to do what we wanted," unquote. And from my point of view, a client smart enough to trust them, that's a good result. Robert Kahn is an architect with many talents. The St. Louis-born, New York-based architect not only designs residence for some of New York's most creative types, including Frank Stella, but he publishes beautifully bound insider travel guides to major cities around the world in a series called City Secrets. I once had the chance to contribute to the one in Rome, and they're printed in old-fashioned printing presses. They're gorgeous books. And he just goes to all the architects and design people he knows and says, "What's your best secret about Rome?" And so it's all inside poop. He also has a keen social conscience. Years ago, he created a set of reasonably priced house blueprints for middle-class people who could not afford to hire an architect. The client could buy the blueprints for a few $100s and then hire a contractor to customize the plans to suit his or her needs. Of course, sorry, maybe my mother designed necklaces, joking. He also works on projects at the very highest level. 2 years ago, he finished this Greenwich Village loft for a dancer and her rich angel investor husband. It is a couture job. He reconfigured the space into a duplex, adding a large private dance studio on the second floor. The living room is 30 feet wide and 18 feet deep. The ceiling is 22 feet high. He lined the walls with mahogany and laid the floors with soft leather tiles, and there's a travertine border around the tiles. And then he designed the spectacular steel staircase, which is painted with auto paint. He spent years with his clients sourcing rare vintage pieces of furniture, including a pair of thin-hulled pelican chairs in white lamb's wool from 1940, a standing lamp designed in 1947 by J.T. Kalinar, a desk designed by Pierre Paulin in 1952, and a rare pair of orange lounge chairs designed by Carlo Honner for Forma. The chandelier is a contemporary piece by Jeff Zimmerman, who's since gone on to great fame. This streamlined loft has already been celebrated. It won Apartment of the Year in Interior Design magazine. This is the kind of apartment I thought I was going to be able to live in when I came to New York. This is my dream of bohemian perfection, far from what I found. Calvin Sumrall is a fashion designer who once headed the Lauren division of Ralph Lauren. When he arrived in New York from Louisiana 22 years ago, he had very little money, but luck. He found an affordable duplex penthouse in Greenwich Village. He furnished it with finds from neighborhood antique shops and flea markets. As he recalls today, with a 20-foot hall ceiling, I imagined I was living on the Bay of Naples. Eventually, he met the English decorator, Robert Kahn. Some of you may know that Robert Kahn is Prince Charles's decorator. And he also met a wonderful antique dealer in Cornwall, Connecticut, called Michael Trapp. And they both became mentors and helped him create this 19th century grand tour fantasy. He bought 18th century Swedish chairs, French armchairs, and a pair of 19th century faux bamboo chairs, and wall-mounted a water buffalo set of horns, and bought a Persian sumac carpet in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. To me, it's the platonic ideal of what a Greenwich Village apartment should look like. This is one of the grandest rooms in the book, an Upper East Side atrium turned into a dining room in a 17,000 square foot townhouse on the Upper East Side. The house was designed in 1923 by Cross and Cross, society architects whose clients famously included Sister Parrish's family in Far Hills, New Jersey. The house was once owned by Jimmy Goldsmith, who was a sort of renegade financier, and now belongs to a New York banker. After returning to Manhattan after many years working in the Far East, the owner turned to the New York architect Brian Sawyer of Sawyer Thorson to reconfigure the house and make it family-friendly. The results are astonishing. Sawyer replaced a covered air shaft with this extravagant oculus, had to be brought in from the street by crane. The octagonal skylight now bathes the soaring atrium in natural light. The 8 clear-story windows you see below the skylight are actually two-way mirrors that let light into the bathrooms and dressing rooms behind them. Sawyer installed all the architecture, the detailed classical cornices, the wall paneling. He designed the Georgian-style mantelpiece, sourced the 18th and 19th century English and French antiques. Only the owner's scrolls are original to the collection of the owner. And of course, he decided they should be hung on raw celadon silk. Can you imagine having a candlelight dinner? Howard Slatkin is a decorator of the old school, and his former 6,000 square foot area on Fifth Avenue is testimony to his ability to create 18th century French interiors in New York City. In the entrance hall seen here, the walls are lined with a vintage Versailles scenic wallpaper that was a gift from his mother. The floor is paved with antique French tiles. Pride of place goes to the flowering cherry tree branches in the basket on the round table. They were made by an artist called Carmen Alman, who some of you may know. She's gotten famous since this was done. She was Slatkin's very first employee. And then she married a French sculptor and moved to Bordeaux. And then she got bored, and then she started making these astoundingly lifelike portraits of flowering plants using copper sheeting, brass tubing, wire, and enamel paint. They really look like the real thing. And this is his living room, which could be in a French chateau. It's 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, 11-foot ceiling. It has windows facing both Central Park and south. It is so filled with light, you feel you're in the country. Slatkin is a master of creating magic. Here he installed the Parquet de Versailles floor upside down. and then stained it white to give it a more rustic look. In the white-walled setting, the art and furniture pop, the gilded 18th century French chairs, the gilt bronze candlesticks, the ormolu on the console, the gilded picture frames. He just wants everything to kind of glow in this soft light. Every surface is home to a treasure. Unbelievably, after he spent years, I think 11 years, gutting, renovating, and decorating this Fifth Avenue apartment, he sold it and moved to a townhouse because he thought it was better because he had a book. How could he? Well, now that I've presented you with a real eclectic mix, I'm hoping you might be tempted to buy the book, and I would certainly welcome any questions. Thanks very much. Anybody have any questions? Okay.
Well, wait, give us a couple of minutes to think of some, maybe.
I'm sorry. I welcome you to come to the back of the room and buy a book and say hello, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.